Steel doesn't fail the way people imagine it does. There's no single dramatic moment where a bridge simply gives way without warning. There's a crack, microscopic at first, propagating slowly through a gusset plate or a weld seam, growing by fractions of a millimeter with every heavy truck that crosses, every temperature swing between a July afternoon and a January night, every cycle of expansion and contraction that steel endures silently for decades before anyone notices anything wrong at all. You learn to find those cracks before they find you. That's the entire discipline of structural bridge inspection, distilled down to one sentence I've repeated to every junior engineer I've trained across 32 years in this field. My name is Diane Kowalski. Chief Bridge Inspection Engineer for the State Department of Transportation, responsible for the structural integrity assessment of 211 bridges across a district that includes some of the oldest steel truss crossings still carrying regular commercial traffic in this part of the country. This is a story about the bridge I nearly couldn't save in time, not because nobody warned me, and not because I doubted the warning, but because the warning arrived in a language nobody with the authority to act on it was willing to trust. My cousin Marcus Delgado is 11 years younger than me, the son of my mother's younger sister, close enough in age to my own children that he spent a good portion of his childhood at our family's holiday gatherings treating me more like an aunt than a cousin. He went into structural engineering himself, eventually, though his path bent hard toward computational modeling and machine learning rather than the fieldwork heavy track I'd built my own career on, and by the time he was 31, he built and sold a bridge monitoring startup to the state DOT for enough money that his mother still brings it up, with visible pride, at every family dinner since. The system he built, now deployed across our district under the name SpanSense, used a dense network of strain gauges, accelerometers, and thermal sensors mounted on the district's oldest steel truss bridges, feeding continuous data into a machine learning model trained to identify fatigue crack propagation risk before it became detectable through traditional visual inspection or even standard non-destructive testing methods. It was, by any honest engineering assessment, remarkable technology, capable of identifying subtle stress redistribution patterns across a bridge's load path that no human inspector, however experienced, could reliably detect through periodic manual inspection alone. SpanSense caught the Holloway Creek crack 8 months before your visual inspection schedule would have found it, Diane, Marcus told me, with the specific, slightly defensive pride of a younger relative still working to prove himself to an older one, at a district planning meeting the previous spring. That's 8 months of a district route we didn't have to close, 8 months of a repair we caught while it was still a routine weld reinforcement instead of an emergency closure. I don't dispute the technology, Marcus. I dispute how much weight this district's leadership is prepared to put behind a risk score they can't independently verify, when the decision on the other end is closing a bridge that 40,000 vehicles a day depend on. I want to be fair to what I actually meant by that, because it wasn't skepticism about SpanSense accuracy. The system's validation record, across 3 years of deployment, was genuinely excellent. What I meant, and what I don't think Marcus fully understood until the events of that October, was a distinction that matters enormously in my profession and doesn't always translate cleanly to an engineer trained primarily in computational systems. A risk score, however statistically sound, isn't the same thing as an engineering finding. A finding needs to be traceable, step by step, through calculations another licensed engineer could independently reproduce and verify. A black box model's output, however accurate, isn't something a state official can put their name on to justify closing a major commercial route, not without something underneath it a courtroom or a state legislature could eventually be shown to make sense of. I tried to explain this distinction to Marcus more than once over family dinners, usually with limited success, because I think it genuinely didn't make intuitive sense to someone whose entire professional training treated a validated statistical model as self-evidently sufficient grounds for action. His mother, my Aunt Rosa, used to gently tease both of us at those dinners for turning holiday gatherings into engineering department meetings, and I remember one particular Thanksgiving where Marcus, half joking and half not, told the whole table that my generation of engineers would rather watch a bridge fail than trust a number we couldn't personally derive by hand. I laughed along with everyone else that night. I also privately filed the comment away, because there was enough truth in it, however unfairly phrased, that it stayed with me longer than the rest of the evening's conversation. Wexford Crossing was a steel truss bridge built in 1968, carrying a state highway route across a river gorge that served as one of only two commercial trucking corridors connecting the district's northern industrial zone to the interstate system. It carried, on an average day, close to 9,000 vehicles, a meaningful percentage of them fully loaded commercial trucks, and it had been on my own inspection schedule for a routine biennial assessment the following spring, 6 months out from the events I'm about to describe. SpanSense flagged Wexford Crossing in early September, identifying an anomalous strain redistribution pattern across one of the bridge's primary gusset plate connections at the third truss panel from the north abutment, the kind of connection point where a bridge's load-bearing members meet and transfer force, and precisely the kind of location where a fatigue crack, if one existed, could propagate toward a genuinely catastrophic failure mode rather than a contained, reparable one. The system's risk score placed Wexford Crossing in its highest concern category, a designation it had assigned to only 4 bridges across the district's entire 211 bridge inventory in 3 years of operation, 3 of which had subsequently been confirmed, through manual inspection, to have genuine developing structural issues. Marcus brought the flag to the district's chief engineer, a careful, risk-averse administrator named Howard Pruitt who had run this district's bridge program for 19 years and had, in that time, developed a professional philosophy that I both respected and occasionally found maddening: nothing gets closed, restricted, or emergency repaired without a traceable engineering finding that could withstand scrutiny from the state legislature's Transportation Oversight Committee, the district's insurance underwriters, and, if it ever came to that, a courtroom. Pruitt had come up through the same hand calculation tradition I had, 2 years ahead of me at the same state university engineering program decades earlier, and I think part of why we'd worked well together across 19 years was a shared, sometimes stubborn, insistence on exactly the kind of traceability Marcus's system didn't yet know how to provide. "I can show you the model's confidence interval, Howard," Marcus told him, in a meeting I sat in on specifically because Pruitt had asked me to weigh in, given Wexford's proximity to my own upcoming inspection schedule. 96% confidence this connection is developing a fatigue crack consistent with the load path stress patterns we validated against 3 prior confirmed cases. "I understand the confidence interval, Marcus. What I need, before I can justify restricting truck traffic on a route that 4 industrial employers in this district depend on for daily shipping, is an engineering finding I can put in front of the Transportation Committee that doesn't reduce to, 'the algorithm says so.' Can you show me the actual physical mechanism, traced through the load path, the way a licensed structural engineer would document it?" Marcus couldn't, not in the form Pruitt needed, because SpanSense model, for all its predictive accuracy, was built on pattern recognition across thousands of data points rather than a traceable, step-by-step structural calculation any of us could independently verify by hand. It was, in the most literal sense, a black box, remarkably good at identifying that something was wrong, and structurally incapable of explaining precisely why in the specific technical language a formal engineering finding required. I watched Marcus's frustration build across that meeting, a frustration I understood completely and still couldn't fully help him resolve, because the gap he was running into wasn't a failure of his engineering. It was a genuine, unresolved tension between 2 entirely different standards of proof, one built on statistical validation and the other built on individually traceable causation, and nobody in that room, myself included, had yet figured out how to fully reconcile them. "You're asking me to prove a mechanism my model wasn't built to articulate in those terms," Marcus said, more sharply than I'd heard him speak to Pruitt before. "The pattern recognition is the finding. Demanding I translate it into a hand calculation is asking me to throw away the exact capability that makes this system worth having in the first place. I'm not asking you to throw it away, Marcus. I'm telling you what I'm legally and professionally required to have in hand before I close a route 4 employers depend on. Those aren't the same request, even if they feel that way to you right now. I want to describe the 6 weeks that followed carefully, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, and it's a part that doesn't resolve as cleanly as a dramatic confrontation might suggest." Marcus wasn't wrong. Pruitt wasn't being unreasonable. The gap between them was a genuine, structural problem in how predictive technology intersects with the legal and professional obligations of civil engineering, and closing that gap fell, by default, to me, in the specific, unglamorous way that most real engineering problems eventually get solved, not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through weeks of careful, methodical work that nobody outside the profession ever hears about unless something goes catastrophically wrong first. I initiated a full manual load path analysis on Wexford Crossing's third truss panel connection in mid-September, 6 months ahead of its scheduled biennial inspection, using the same methodical, hand-verified stress calculation approach I'd been trained in 3 decades earlier, pulling the bridge's original 1968 design drawings from the district archive, a set of blueprints so old the paper had gone soft and amber at the edges, and cross-referencing 60 years of documented traffic load increases against the connection's original design tolerances, a process that took the better part of a week working alongside a structural analyst half my age who'd never worked from physical blueprints before and kept, with visible fascination, photographing the original engineer's handwritten calculations in the margins. The physical inspection itself required a specialized bridge inspection vehicle and 2 full days suspended beneath the span in a basket, close enough to the actual steel to run my own hands across the connection the way I've done 1,000 times across my career, the wind off the river gorge cutting through my jacket in a way that 32 years of doing this work has never quite made comfortable, whatever else it's made familiar. What I found, on physical inspection, was a hairline crack in the gusset plate, roughly 4 centimeters in length, positioned exactly where Spansen's model had flagged elevated stress redistribution, a crack too small to have been reliably caught by the district's standard visual inspection protocol, which relied on inspectors working from an elevated platform without the specific ultrasonic testing equipment that direct hands-on access allowed me to bring to this particular connection. I spent the following 10 days building a traditional engineering finding around that crack, hand calculations tracing the actual load redistribution through the truss's remaining structural members, a fatigue propagation model based on documented traffic load history rather than machine learning pattern recognition, and a formal structural assessment that arrived, through an entirely different methodology, at essentially the same conclusion Spansen's had reached 6 weeks earlier through its own means. Wexford Crossing's third truss panel connection was approaching a critical fatigue threshold, and continued unrestricted heavy truck traffic carried a meaningfully elevated risk of accelerated crack propagation toward eventual connection failure. What turned those 10 days from urgent into genuinely critical was a piece of information that arrived, almost incidentally, in the district's routine oversize load permitting queue, a scheduled convoy of 3 specialized transport trucks, carrying prefabricated turbine components for a wind farm project 60 miles north, requesting permitted passage across Wexford Crossing the following week, each vehicle carrying a gross weight nearly triple the bridge's standard commercial load rating. Permitted under the state's oversize load exception process specifically because Wexford's original 1968 load rating, on paper, technically accommodated it with a calculated margin that had never accounted for 60 years of accumulated fatigue stress on a connection nobody until recently had reason to flag as compromised. I brought my completed manual finding to Pruitt the same afternoon I discovered the convoy's scheduled crossing date, 4 days before the trucks were due to arrive. I have a traceable structural finding now, Howard. Hand calculations, physical inspection documentation, ultrasonic crack measurement, everything the Transportation Committee would need to independently verify this if it ever came to that. The crack is real. It's in exactly the location Marcus's system flagged 6 weeks ago. And there's an oversized convoy scheduled to cross that exact connection point in 4 days carrying triple the standard load rating. Pruitt read through my documentation in full, the way he read through everything, methodically, without visible urgency even as I sat across from him doing the private mathematics of exactly how many days we had left. When he finally looked up, there was something in his expression that told me he understood precisely what he was looking at. This is what I needed 6 weeks ago, Diane. I couldn't act on a confidence interval. I can act on this. He issued an emergency load restriction on Wexford Crossing within the hour, rerouting the oversized convoy to a longer, more expensive alternate route 60 miles out of the way, and closed the bridge to all commercial truck traffic pending emergency gusset plate reinforcement, a repair completed within 3 weeks, restoring full commercial capacity to a connection that engineering analysis confirmed, once the plate was removed for replacement, had been within a projected margin of months, not years, from a fatigue crack propagation event that could have produced a genuinely catastrophic partial span failure under the exact load conditions that oversized convoy would have placed on it. Marcus called me the evening the restriction was issued, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't triumphant on either side, and I think that honesty matters. I could hear, in the first few seconds of his voice on the phone, that same particular mixture of vindication and hurt I remembered from childhood arguments decades earlier, the specific tone of a younger cousin who's been proven right and still somehow doesn't feel like he's won anything. 6 weeks, Diane. My system had this 6 weeks before your inspection confirmed it. If Pruitt had trusted the confidence interval instead of needing hand calculations he could take to a committee, we'd have caught this in September instead of racing a convoy in October. You're not wrong about the 6 weeks, Marcus. I want you to hear me say that clearly. But I want you to also sit with the fact that, trust the confidence interval, isn't a standard this profession can adopt wholesale, not yet, not when the downside of being wrong is a bridge failure with vehicles on it and a court eventually asking someone to explain, step by step, why a restriction was or wasn't issued based on a number nobody in the room could independently verify. So what happens next time your 6 weeks of manual verification isn't fast enough? What happens the time there isn't a convenient window before the next oversize convoy happens to expose the gap? That was the question that actually mattered, and I didn't have a clean answer for him that night, only the beginning of one that took the following several months, and a genuinely collaborative effort between the two of us, to properly build. I remember sitting with that question long after we'd hung up, turning it over the way I turn over a structural problem I haven't yet found the right angle into, because I knew, even defending Pruitt's caution as strongly as I had, that Marcus's underlying point wasn't going away just because I'd out-argued him on a single phone call. We spent that winter developing a new protocol together, meeting most Sundays at my kitchen table the way we used to as kids doing homework at that same table decades earlier, this time with structural drawings and statistical validation reports spread across it instead of algebra worksheets. SpanSense's highest-tier risk flags now trigger an expedited manual verification process, a compressed version of what I'd done on Wexford Crossing over 10 days, prioritized and resourced specifically to close the gap between a statistically sound risk score and a traceable engineering finding as quickly as the physical work allows, rather than waiting for a routine inspection cycle to catch up to what the model had already found. Pruitt approved dedicated emergency inspection funding for exactly this purpose the following budget cycle. The first time in 19 years, he told me, that he'd requested funding for a category of expense that didn't yet have a name anywhere in the department's existing budget categories. Wexford Crossing carries its full traffic load again now, the repaired gusset plate connection instrumented with an additional cluster of SpanSense sensors specifically monitoring that exact location, feeding data back into a model that Marcus has since retrained, in part, on the physical crack propagation data my own manual inspection generated. A genuinely reciprocal improvement neither of us could have produced working entirely apart from the other. He sent me, a few months after the repair was finished, an early draft of a paper he was preparing for a structural engineering conference, co-authored with my name alongside his, documenting the case as an example of what he called, only half-jokingly, productive disagreement between two kinds of proof. I still have it printed out in a folder in my office, the only conference paper I've ever been listed as a co-author on that I didn't write a single sentence of myself, though I like to think the 10 days of hand calculations underneath it were mine as much as they were his models. I still believe, as strongly as I did before that October, that a risk score is not the same thing as an engineering finding, and that the specific discipline of tracing a structural conclusion back through verifiable calculation isn't bureaucratic caution for its own sake, but the actual foundation of what makes this profession trustworthy to the public whose lives depend on it. Marcus still believes, and I've come to agree with him more than I once did, that a system capable of finding what his does, 6 weeks before traditional methods would have caught it, represents something this profession can't afford to treat as merely supplementary much longer, however uncomfortable that acceleration feels to those of us trained in a slower tradition. Neither of us has fully resolved which of those two convictions should ultimately govern how bridges like Wexford Crossing get protected in the future. What we built instead, working through that disagreement together rather than around it, is a process that no longer requires either of us to be entirely right, only fast enough, together, to close the 6 weeks that once separated a machine's correct answer from a bridge official's ability to act on it before a convoy full of turbine parts ever had the chance to find out which one of us was wrong. Steel still doesn't fail the way people imagine it does. It still whispers its warnings for months before it ever raises its voice, in strain gauge readings, in hairline cracks too small for a standard inspection to catch, in the particular language of stress and fatigue that neither a machine learning model nor a licensed engineer working entirely alone has ever fully learned to speak on its own. It took both of us, working the same crack from two different directions, to translate that whisper into something the rest of the world could finally act on in time.